It was about 9:45. I had our older two down. The kitchen was finally wiped clean. The house had settled into the quiet that I spend all day craving. My wife was finishing up with our youngest one, getting in a last second snuggle. So I sat down on the couch, and this was it: the reward for a day of disciplined, structured fun and activity, and a lot of really good, fulfilling family stuff. So I was supposed to be at peace. But instead, I'm sitting there tapping my foot, twitching my fingers, and my mind's beginning to churn through the next day's schedule. I'm starting to tweak my summer curriculum plans. I'm running a replay loop of where I lost my patience that afternoon. And I reached for my phone because sitting in silence with myself felt worse than scrolling. I had successfully managed the entire house into stillness, but I couldn't manufacture it inside myself. When I usually wake up, I don a mask: the chef, teacher, disciplinarian, judge, scheduler, player, cleaner, and organizer. I've learned to make my attitude around these masks peaceful, pleasant, and dutiful. Why? Because the masks plus the attitude puts my family on their best terms. But sometimes it's a performance. A few years ago, I got lost behind the performance and production of being a husband and a father. It didn't help my family or me. Now, it's scary to call out the performance like that because it feels like that ancient Greek word turned modern derogative for mass performers: hypocrite. A lot of times we're left wondering who we really are. Are we the mask or the unknown thing underneath it? And if the thing underneath it is monstrous, is it not better, kinder, more loving to keep the mask on? We really do love our family after all, and they seem to thrive when we're in performance mode. But we never let them see the real us. And in wearing that mask of masterful performance, we lose ourselves. This whole series has been about exploring the man under the mask. And this video, Mansion 4 of 7, as described by St. Teresa of Avila in The Interior Castle, isn't a battle for good over evil, nor a call to complex new work. It's about the simple truth of letting yourself be reached. My name is Jacob Pannell, and this is Faithful Fatherhood. If you've been reading along or watching along, we've been exploring the layers of the soul as described by St. Teresa of Avila in her work, The Interior Castle. Mansion 1 or layer 1 was mapped onto the brainstem. It's reptilian and reactive. The work of that mansion was moving past pure reaction, past the raw fight or flight of a life lived on the surface. Mansion 2 was mapped onto our cortex. That's typically what we think of when we hear the word brain. Reasoning and rationality, closing the gap between who you are and who you want to be. And that mansion, my daughter and I passed notes. Mansion 3 was the two of them together. Mastery, the hard-won use of your whole mind to order your life, your faith, and your fatherhood. But Mansion 4 is where that mastery, our brains maybe, run out. Not because they actually stop working. It works just fine. Our cortex is still humming along. Our mastery is still there. But the mastery can't take you any further because the thing St. Teresa is describing here isn't mastered. It's received. Last week, we talked about trying to get into that open hand posture. Your disciplined, ordered, optimized, mastered mind has no way to receive what St. Teresa is describing that we should be getting in Mansion 4. The only tool you have is the one that has to step aside or surrender. St. Teresa actually gives us a precise image for what's kind of happening at this threshold. She describes two kinds of water basins. The first fills through aqueducts. It's pipes, pumps, and engineered human effort. Work to fill it, and it stays full. Stop working, and it drains. The second basin is built directly over a spring. It fills silently from below, without noise or effort. And sometimes it feels a little bit slower than we'd like it to. You don't pump that second basin. You can't pump it. You can only position yourself over the source and let it rise. The first basin is everything Mansion trained you to build. Mansion 3 trained you to build. That work is real. None of it is wasted in Mansion 4. But the pipes of your own effort don't go deeper than Mansion 3. And then St. Teresa tells us what happens to the soul that stops pumping and lets the spring rise. She quotes the psalmist, and I like the King James version because it ties a little bit more directly into the translation that I've been reading. The psalmist says, "When thou didst dilate my heart," or "when you enlarge my heart" is one of the newer translations. The basin built over the spring doesn't just fill, it expands. It becomes larger than it was, capable of holding more than the aqueducts ever delivered. The buffer keeps your heart the same size. The spring makes it bigger. That is the difference between a faith that is managed and a faith that is received. One stays the size you built it. The other keeps growing. Here's the specific quote that St. Teresa is using to describe the soul in this room. So this is St. Teresa right here. "It puzzled me to see that while all appearance, the powers of the soul were occupied with God and recollected in him, the imagination was wandering elsewhere." The deeper part of St. Teresa had quieted, but the surface wouldn't. She compares the wandering surface to something kind of noisy, a mill that keeps clacking away while the wheat is being ground. You can't stop the grinding, and you shouldn't try. Elsewhere, she sharpens the image. The imagination is out in the precincts of the castle, as those outer layers it's already been, wrestling with 1,000 wild, venomous creatures, while the deepest part of the soul is already with God in one of the innermost rooms. Your will has found the stillness. Your imagination is still out in the courtyard picking fights. The creatures are not a spiritual failure. They're a category error. But it's not understanding what needs to happen. Here's where St. Teresa is going to start connecting things for us. And I underlined this quote twice as I was reading through. "As a rule, all our anxieties and troubles come from misunderstanding our own nature." Let me say that again. As a rule, all our anxieties and troubles come from misunderstanding our own nature. It's a remarkable sentence for a 16th century nun to write, not because it's theologically radical, it isn't, but because it sounds something like you'd hear on a therapy podcast. She isn't blaming demons. She isn't blaming culture. She isn't even primarily blaming sin. She's saying you're confused about what kind of thing you are, and that confusion is where your suffering lives. Our suffering lives in the production of our own lives. We believe that if we order everything just so, the right evening routine, the right phone setting, the right supplement, the right amount of willpower, we can manufacture peace. And we believe that peace is downstream of our performance, just like an aqueduct. St. Teresa's whole argument is that this is exactly backwards. Peace isn't produced, it's received. And the attempt to produce it is what keeps blocking our reception. St. Teresa has precise language for this. She calls the peace we generate through our own effort sweetness, real devotion, genuinely good, but starting with us. She calls what arrives from the spring consolation, beginning with God, landing in us. Without engineering it, sweetness is the aqueduct water, consolation is the spring. Both are water. Only one dilates the basin, which would be a nice 16th century insight, except that 500 years later, we've actually built our entire civilization on the attempt to produce that very peace. To understand why Mansion 4 is so hard to reach in the modern world, I want to borrow from a philosopher, Charles Taylor. That's not because these souls are chasing philosophy, but because he's mapped in a little bit of obsessive detail the exact wall St. Teresa is telling us to stop building. In Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, it's a 1,000-page argument that Western culture, somewhere around the Enlightenment, decided the natural world was all there is. He calls the result the immanent frame. So transcendent is usually this, immanent is this when we're using that kind of theological language. The immanent frame is a way of living in which meaning, peace, purpose, and worth all have to be generated from your own effort. Inside the immanent frame, you are the sole engineer of your life. Nothing flows in from the outside. If you want to feel at peace, you build a system that generates peace. If you want to feel loved, you build a persona that generates love. If you want to feel like a man, you build a posture that generates masculinity. The frame works, sort of, until it runs out of its own energy. Charles Taylor's next move is to notice that modern people inside the immanent frame still experience what he calls cross pressure. It's a pressure that pulls us in two different directions, sometimes at once. You can feel the pull of transcendent meaning. You just can't quite name or justify it. You feel what he calls the malaise of immanence, a flatness, and is this all there really is? A sense that the whole operation is missing something. St. Teresa called these pulls consolations, and they come from God. They can't be manufactured. They come from surrender. You can feel the machinery of your own effort pulling you one way and something older, quieter, and more true pulling you the other. The deeper part of you knows it needs something it cannot manufacture. The surface part refuses to stop trying. Modernity didn't invent this problem. It industrialized it. And the temptation most of us fall for is to pretend we didn't feel the transcendent pull. Instead, we go back to optimizing. Charles Taylor also gives us the right word, I think, for the posture most fathers have adopted in response to the cross pressure of the immanent frame. And he calls it the buffered self. The buffered self is the modern default. It's the person who keeps a thick boundary between their interior and everything else outside it. The buffered self is in control. The buffered self doesn't let things in without permission. And it manages its own moods, manufactures its own meaning, optimizes its own inputs, and holds the outside world at a careful distance. Strip away the pseudo-silence and the vocabulary of the manosphere, and what you're actually looking at is the discipline of buffering. It's a thickening of the boundary, a hardening of the posture. That idea of stop feeling so much. Get the output right, and the inside will follow. That's just the exterior solution to an interior problem. It doesn't work. It can't work. If St. Teresa figured this out 500 years ago, this is not some new age something. This is deep wisdom. St. Teresa was watching it fail inside a Carmelite convent in 1577. Our faith doesn't respond to the buffer. It responds to surrender. A buffered dad, for example, is the man trying to be present through sheer force of will. He might actually be calm on the couch, but he's churning behind his eyes. He's physically in the room, but functionally elsewhere. He is fine in a way that is costing him and his family more than he realizes. Because the buffer doesn't just keep bad things out, it keeps everything out. The wife, the kids, God, the Saturday morning, a hand reaching and trying to touch you on your shoulder, to connect with you. Somewhere in your life, you are being buffered at. Someone you love is trying to reach you and hitting your wall. You can feel it. You just don't know how to lower it because the wall is the only strategy you were given. That's why we're going back 500 years to a nun to figure out a way to lower our own walls, to connect with the people we're desperate to connect with. So before we get into some strategies on dissolving that buffered self, let's look at maybe 5 ways that St. Teresa kind of points out that we are actually still performing or buffering. The first one is productivity as prayer. You've let the output of your faith become the proof of your interior life. You did the thing, you read it, you wrote it, you showed up. You're fine. You have the performance data. You just don't have the presence. The second one, optimized spirituality. You've built a system for your life that's humming along. You have the app, the reading plan, the morning rhythm. None of that is the problem. The problem is the quiet belief that the system is producing the goods, that your spiritual output is evidence of your spiritual depth. You're just leaning into building more pipes. You've done good work. Those pipes just can't reach the spring. The third one, anxiety as an engine. You've quietly come to believe, and this is way down deep sometimes, that your anxiety is what actually makes you responsible. If you stopped being anxious, you'd stop being a good dad. So you keep that anxiety engine running and call that churn love. Fourth, and this one hits home to me so true. Information as insulation. You consume more content, more podcasts, more books, more Substacks, more scripture studies, more up here. As if the next piece of input will be the one that finally closes the loop. It won't. I've been there. I live that way sometimes. It won't close the loop. You're not underinformed. You're buffered. The fifth one, self-suppression as discipline. You've learned to suppress your emotion and called it manhood. St. Teresa is bluntly against this. We can't get caught up in God if we focus on suppressing ourselves. The buffer isn't strength. It's a wall pretending to be a spine. Any of these 5 can masquerade as growth. All of them keep the spring at the bottom of our basin sealed. So Charles Taylor doesn't just give us the buffered self, he gives us the opposite. It's called the porous self, a person open to what flows in from outside the closed system. So it makes sense. Porousness is not weakness. It's not passivity. It is not the absence of discipline. It is the specific posture St. Teresa is begging the Mansion 4 soul to adopt, the willingness to stop manufacturing and start receiving. Is there any more frightening word than surrender? But that's what Mansion 4 requires. And then it's also going to give us the cross pressure to test how well we've surrendered. We can try to manufacture the peace ourselves or decide there's nothing deeper to be found. Both of those pressures pull us back into the careful mastery of Mansion 3. I know that pull well. I've optimized plenty of things that looked like faithfulness and felt, if I'm honest, like performance. The morning routine that became a metric, the prayer that became a checklist item. Mastery is comfortable, and it even looks virtuous from the outside. But at some point, I started to notice that all the aqueducts that were trying to get me spiritually full were humming. They were working. I was doing the things, but nothing was actually filling my soul. St. Teresa teaches us to be suspicious of the impulse to acquire more, to work harder. There's a word for the courage that it takes to build those aqueducts: glory. You're performing correctly. You're producing the right output. You're earning the visible win. Glory is loud and measurable, and the modern world sells it constantly. It's in the boardroom. It's in the manosphere. And it's probably in your own bathroom when you're staring at yourself in the mirror, brushing your teeth, trying to get ready in the morning. To build up that self, to hype yourself up to succeed that day. There's another word, though: valor. And that moves in the opposite direction. It is the courage to surrender, to voluntarily lay down the need for control, the buffered walls, the performance of a fatherhood you've been running since before you knew you were running it. Valor is harder won than glory, precisely because it is displayed in loss. Let's look at maybe a scriptural reference, a story that you might be familiar with, the story of Elijah, to see how this looks like. Now, if you remember, Elijah has this one particularly famous moment on Mount Carmel. He did the most dramatic thing there. He engineered a public spiritual showdown, called down fire from heaven onto a water-soaked altar, and humiliated the opposing prophets. It was Mansion 3 mastery at full amplitude, disciplined, bold, and completely on display. But immediately after the victory, he's all empty. He runs away in terror. He collapses under a juniper tree and asks God to let him die. The machinery of his own effort ran out. He is the man who did everything right and still can't quite land. God feeds him, lets him sleep, and sends him to Mount Horeb, not to build on the Carmel victory, but to be taught something the victory could not teach. Elijah expects God to show up in the dramatic. Here's the verse. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. The wind, the earthquake, the fire, loud, measurable, impressive. The phenomena a buffered, performing man expects from God. But God is in what comes next: a still, small voice. To hear it, Elijah had to stop producing all of his stuff. He had to wrap his face in his mantle, step out of the cave, and just listen. Mount Carmel was glory. Mount Horeb was valor. Elijah had to get to the end of his own pumping, his own effort, before he could hear the spring that was right underneath him. And that's how it kind of is with fatherhood. It takes a lot of glory to build the aqueducts. It takes valor to abandon them. And that's against nearly everything our culture has ever taught us: our technology, our metrics, our entire architecture of self-improvement. all maximize the desire to overcome rather than surrender. But which is actually braver? To relentlessly manage your family from behind the safety of your mask, or to become porous enough to let them actually reach you? Here's what St. Teresa gets. She doesn't just say the aqueducts can't reach the spring. She goes further. She names the exact move the soul has to make, and it isn't retirement, it's capture. St. Teresa is blunt about why the aqueducts will always fall short. This is quoting St. Teresa, this water does not flow through aqueducts. God alone gives it to whom he chooses. You can't pump your way to peace. You can't optimize your way to presence. You can't systemize your way to the interior life that fills you up, that your family needs you to have. But here's the strange thing. She doesn't say the answer is to stop everything and wait. She describes what happens to the will in this room. I circled it in the actual footnote on one of the pages, and I keep coming back to it. She writes that in the fourth mansion, the will enters a state where it becomes a captive that gives a simple consent to become the prisoner of God. Without understanding how it happened, not coerced, not passive, not inert, a consent to captivity. That's the move. Consent to captivity. Our will is fully engaged. It's not taking our hands off the steering wheel. The mode has shifted from building to yielding, from engineering to opening. The will doesn't disappear in Mansion 4. It finally stops trying to be the source. This is the move at the threshold. You stop building, you start receiving. The force of arms, the fierce, disciplined interior work of the early mansions got you here. None of that's wasted. But at this door, we have to adopt a different posture. St. Teresa's image for this newly porous soul is startling. It's still not my favorite image, but maybe it'll resonate with you better. She said it is like a newborn babe, first feeding at its mother's breast. All the mastery, all the discipline, all the spiritual portfolio, and the picture of the soul in the next deeper room is an infant being fed. We've achieved what so many consider to be the height of our manhood by Mansion 3. And the next room is an infant being fed. Not earning, not producing, not managing, but receiving. Entirely dependent on a flow it did not, cannot generate. That's it. That's the whole move of Mansion 4. Painfully simple, incredibly difficult to actually let go. So let's tie all this into a Monday for me. Mondays are some of my most restful days. Our weekends are absolutely bananas, especially Sunday. And I've recently gotten into the habit of vegging on the couch next to my youngest while he watches Paw Patrol. I check email, catch up on some articles, and maybe sneak in a game of Hearthstone. We're both next to each other, buffered by our screens. Thankfully, he cuts through the buffer sooner than I do, like his mom, and we start playing. Playing is a great way to ease into a more porous posture because there's a lot of giggling with my youngest. And that's when we actually start connecting. And if I'm doing well in Mansion 4, I just let him take over. Sometimes the activity ends in Legos or lunch, but the soul work always ends with him feeling seen and loved because I've opened myself up to him so that he can see me, not the performance of fatherhood that I sometimes use as a mask. He sees the real me. And when he sees the real me, I see the real him. That's the gift The kids keep offering you that most dads refuse. Children can't be mastered. They can be known, loved, shepherded, and raised. They can't be managed into yielding their interior to you. Sometimes I do it. Sometimes I fall back into being the buffered dad who tries anyways. I optimize their sleep, their schooling, their screens, their diets, their developmental arcs. Some of that's good work, but none of that reaches them. What reaches them is my porousness. The dad who puts down the phone and actually hears the weird question at dinner and engages, or maybe even tells the story of how he learned that. And maybe it was a little bit embarrassing. It's the dad who lets himself cry at the school play without trying to hide it. The dad who's willing to be a newborn of his own faith, latched, dependent, unproductive, long enough that his children see a man who didn't have to manufacture everything he has. Every Mansion 4 rehearsal you do in your kitchen is one that trains the posture you bring to God. And it goes the other way too. If you stay buffered, you can stay in Mansion 3, calling your mastery the summit. Your children will inherit a father they cannot actually reach. They'll grow up with a man who was present and unavailable. They'll not know which is the real you, probably because you don't know. There's only the outside and the wall of you. That's what we're trying to pass down. Not just whether you can go deeper, but whether they can go deeper. So here's some practical, maybe a question, a takeaway before we end our time together. Where this week are you over-engineering? Not where are you working hard. Work is good. The first 3 mansions were full of good, hard work, and none of it is being undone. I'm asking you something more specific. Where are you trying to manufacture, through effort, something that was only ever going to come to you by gift? Where is the aqueduct you've been maintaining for years that was never going to reach the spring anyway? Name it if you can. Tell someone, not because naming it fixes it. Naming it's not going to fix it overnight. But naming it causes the buffer to dissolve. This is the quiet triumph St. Teresa keeps pointing to throughout the pages of Mansion 4. Not the triumph over good or evil, just the simple truth of letting yourself be reached. The 4th mansion is the beginning of porousness. It's the room where you stop being impressed by your own effort and start being quiet enough to notice that you were never the source in the first place. We have to trust that there is a spring beneath us and accept that our pumping only clogs up the flow of fulfillment. My name is Jacob Pannell, and this